Bugatti Veyron I bought for the very first time, but clearly I can't drive it like this. The reason this car is in two halves is because it's got a gearbox problem.
A stranger took Mark Maccan's deposit, promised him a rare Bugatti gearbox from Australia, and vanished the moment he landed in Spain to collect it. That scam wasn't even the worst part of this story. A dealer had already told him to back out before he bought this Veyron at all, calling it scrap to his face. The gearbox wasn't in the car for 6 weeks. Bugatti refused to even give him a price to fix it, and a Dutch specialist's best guess at a clutch material failed on the very first drive.
Put the gearbox back in the car, or is this seal just not worth the risk? We can't get a seal. It's a Bugatti-specific part.
Here's how all of that somehow ended in a £2 million car. Let's get into it. He ignored every warning. Every hypercar story needs a warning nobody listens to, and this one came from the most qualified person in the room. Carl had sold 2 of the last Veyron Grand Sport Vitesse models on the market himself, watched their prices climb past £1 million each, and understood better than almost anyone what separated a genuine bargain from a genuine disaster. When Mark showed him this particular Veyron, a rare Mansory-bodied example, chrome-finished, one of 5 in that specification ever produced, Carl's red was immediate. Back out. That car is scrapped. Get your money back if you can. The moment itself carried real weight because of how it happened. Mark arrived at Carl's showroom with cameras already rolling, telling Carl only that he had something to share. Carl, who knows nearly every Veyron in the country by its chassis number alone.
I worked as Carl's assistant just 1 year ago, and now I'm his wealth manager. Bugatti successful.
Guessed the specific car before Mark even said it out loud. What followed was not encouragement. Carl's honest reaction, delivered in the moment without any softening for the cameras, amounted to open disbelief that Mark had actually gone through with a purchase this risky. How does a buyer sit across from a trusted advisor, hear an answer that blunt, and still walk away having already spent the money? Is there a more direct warning a buyer could receive than a specialist dealer calling a car unsellable to its own owner's face? Mark had already committed. The negotiation had dragged on for months, the price sliding from an initial £1.5 million down through £1.2 million, and finally settling at £900,000, a number that only made sense because the seller, a man in the business of dealing rare Bugattis, kept losing patience with a market where every viewing pushed the asking price up another £100,000 on other cars entirely. What does it say about a negotiation when the price keeps falling, not because the buyer pushed harder?
Mark Maccan, a car fanatic, an off-road champion and car collector.
The average was to make cars like, well, buy cars like this, sell them.
But because the seller simply ran out of patience, waiting for someone else to say yes first. Mark's friend Ollie had one piece of advice sitting in a pub during the negotiation. Wait. And if the price comes down enough, it's good for the channel. The car itself, when Mark finally arrived to collect it, was not what anyone had described. Photos had shown a driving, complete vehicle. In person, it sat in bits, 3/4 assembled at best, with an engine misfire nobody had disclosed, a spoiler that didn't deploy, and a nose lift system that had reportedly failed as well.
This is replicating the engine right here. And if you imagine, if you come around here, so this is the engine, and that the engine in the car which rotates the gearbox.
How much of buying a car sight unseen is really just deciding how much you trust the photographs someone else chose to send you? What buyer commits £900,000 to a car this incomplete, on the word of a stranger and a handful of photographs? Mark did. Partly because a previous owner, a man Mark described as genuinely honest, had warned him about every single fault in advance, and every warning turned out to be accurate. The one thing nobody had told him, and the one thing that would define the next 6 months entirely, was that the gearbox wasn't in the car at all. Part of what pushed Mark toward this decision in the first place had nothing to do with this specific car. He had spent time watching independent coverage of a separate Bugatti rebuild.
Bugatti, working Bugatti Veyron for the same total price. Right now, we have a £900,000 ornament.
The Chiron project belonging to an owner named Alex, documented extensively by builder Matt Armstrong, and had seen firsthand that expensive Bugatti components could, in fact, be sourced, repaired, and cross-referenced without ever going through the manufacturer at all. If someone else had already proven a Chiron could be rebuilt against Bugatti's wishes, why couldn't the same logic apply to a Veyron a full generation older, with parts theoretically even easier to find? The missing gearbox mystery. For the first 6 weeks of ownership, Mark didn't even know where his own gearbox was. He had been told, with no further detail, that it was somewhere in Holland. Not with whom, not in what condition. Just Holland, a country, not an address, holding the single most important component of a £900,000 car Mark had already paid for in full. How does an owner sleep at night knowing the heart of his own car is sitting unaccounted for in another country entirely? Desperate for a faster answer, the search widened beyond official channels. Word spread that Mark was hunting for a replacement gearbox, and offers began arriving. People claiming access to Bugatti's parts network. People claiming to know of spare units sitting unused. Should any owner trust an unsolicited offer for a part this specific and this valuable, arriving out of nowhere the moment word gets out that you're looking? One of those offers looked too good to walk away from. A man claimed to have a second-hand gearbox pulled from a crash-damaged Veyron in Australia, bundled together with a rare control module that was otherwise nearly impossible to source anywhere. The numbers made the deal feel close to risk-free. Buy the parts, keep what wasn't needed, and effectively profit from the transaction, regardless of outcome. Mark sent a deposit of £3,500 and flew to Malaga to complete the purchase, carrying the remaining balance to close a deal worth roughly £60,000 once every included part was counted. There was no gearbox. There never had been. The man who arranged the deal knew exactly who Mark was, had watched the channel, and vanished the moment the exchange was supposed to happen, leaving Mark roughly £7,000 lighter and legal proceedings now underway to recover it. Is it worse to lose money to a stranger, or to a stranger who specifically targeted you because he knew your face from the internet? For Mark, it was clearly the second, and it wasn't even the lowest point still ahead of him. Word of the scam spread quickly once Mark documented it publicly, and the reaction split cleanly down two lines. Some viewers treated it as an inevitable cost of buying a car this rare through unofficial channels, the kind of risk anyone chasing hard-to-find parts eventually runs into. Others saw it as confirmation of exactly the kind of predatory behavior that circles any high-profile purchase once it becomes public online. Does putting a build this expensive on camera invite more help than it invites exploitation, or is it closer to an even trade between the two? A barrister connected to the channel has since taken up the case directly, with the stated goal of recovering what was lost, though as of the most recent update, nothing had yet been returned. Does documenting a scam publicly help recover the money faster, or does it simply serve as a warning for the next owner facing the exact same offer? What made the loss sting further was how close it had come to working. The bundled control module included in the fraudulent deal was, by every account, genuinely difficult to source. The kind of part that, had it actually existed, would have justified a price this steep on its own. The entire structure of the offer had been built to feel like a no-brainer specifically because it nearly was one, which made the eventual reveal that none of it was real land even harder than a more obviously suspicious scam would have. The silence that changed everything. While the search for a real gearbox continued, Mark tried the most obvious path available to any owner, calling Bugatti directly. He wasn't asking for free parts or special treatment. He wanted a quote to fix his own car, a car with full manufacturer service history and no history of damage, abuse, or suspicious ownership of the kind that makes dealerships wary of certain vehicles. He was prepared to pay whatever a new gearbox actually cost, reportedly somewhere near £300,000. Bugatti wouldn't even give him that number. This wasn't the first time Mark and Carl had run into pricing this steep from a hypercar manufacturer. During an earlier project involving a McLaren P1, the two had been quoted roughly £60,000 simply for brake discs, a number that, on a car worth over £1.5 million, at least came with a real conversation attached to it. Bugatti's silence stood out precisely because it withheld even that basic courtesy. Is a manufacturer that charges enormous prices, but explains them somehow more trustworthy than one that refuses to name a price at all. What does it take for a manufacturer to refuse a paying customer basic pricing information on their own flagship product? According to Mark's own account, the silence stretched for days at a time. No callbacks, no email replies, nothing resembling a real conversation. It wasn't a firm no, it was simply nothing, which in some ways felt worse than an outright refusal would have. Carl's theory, offered directly in conversation, centered on exposure, a growing body of independent YouTube content already existing around Bugattis, and their true cost of ownership. Content the manufacturer reportedly had little interest in feeding further, especially content showing a car being split in half and rebuilt outside official channels. Does protecting a luxury brand's mystique justify refusing to even discuss pricing with an owner who wants to pay full price? Carl didn't think Bugatti needed a single YouTube channel to move its cars, given the manufacturer's existing client list of established buyers, but he suspected the company had calculated that engaging publicly carried more risk than staying silent ever could. Whatever the real reason, the silence left Mark with exactly one option remaining: find the actual gearbox in Holland, and find someone capable of making it work without a single word of factory support. There was a second theory worth considering, rooted in the Veyron's own history rather than pure brand protection. The average original Veyron buyer, according to figures Bugatti itself once released, owned dozens of other cars, several boats, and typically an aircraft as well. A customer base built entirely around exclusivity and discretion rather than public conversation. A car that started at £875,000 plus tax for early blind orders, jumping to a full $1 million plus tax once officially revealed at the Geneva Motor Show, was never designed with independent repair culture in mind. Every part of the ownership experience, historically, ran through the factory, priced accordingly, with buyers who neither needed nor wanted a public conversation about cost. Does a brand built entirely on that kind of exclusivity know how to respond to an owner treating the car like any other machine that occasionally needs fixing? The evidence suggests not. Silence in this context may not have been a strategy at all. It may simply have been a company with no established playbook for a customer behaving in a way its business model never anticipated. The gearbox that almost ended. The build. The real gearbox, it turned out, was sitting with a specialist named Pascal, a contact reached only after weeks of dead ends and false leads from people who ultimately couldn't help at all. Pascal agreed almost immediately to let cameras document the process, a level of openness nobody had received from Bugatti itself. But the gearbox alone wasn't a solution. The clutch material inside it needed replacing, and without access to Bugatti's original specifications, Pascal had to guess at the composition entirely, drawing on years of specialist experience to estimate a material that could survive the extreme forces this particular drivetrain would generate. A mechanic named Rob became deeply involved during this stage, reportedly spending hours on the phone, working through the details before traveling to Holland in person to help refine the build. How many strangers volunteer serious unpaid time toward fixing another man's £900,000 mistake purely because the problem itself was interesting enough to solve? According to Mark, several specialist companies involved in this project ultimately refused payment entirely, treating the build as a genuinely fascinating technical challenge rather than simply another paying job. A specialist company that had already handled other cars for Mark, including earlier classic Lamborghini work, also became involved at this stage, adding another layer of expertise to a project that increasingly resembled a coalition of volunteers rather than a single contracted repair. Word of the project spread further once footage started reaching a wider audience, and that spread ended up mattering more than anyone initially expected. Additional specialists, including people with direct former experience at Bugatti itself and at the original gearbox manufacturer, began reaching out unprompted to offer input once they saw the build online. Small corrections arrived this way too.
The problem is nobody has a test rig which fits the Bugatti gearbox, other than the people that made it originally.
A warning about an incorrectly specified gasket, caught and fixed before it could cause a bigger problem further down the line, arrived directly from someone simply watching the footage. Would any of this expertise have surfaced at all if the entire process had stayed private, hidden from public view the way Bugatti itself seemed to prefer? Consider what that says about the difference between a closed system and an open one. Bugatti held every piece of specialist knowledge this build actually needed, locked inside a company that refused to share any of it. The internet, made up of strangers with no obligation to help at all, ended up supplying nearly the same depth of expertise for free, simply because the problem was public and interesting enough to attract attention. Which version of that story actually protects an owner better in the long run? A manufacturer guarding its knowledge, or a scattered community willing to share it? Before the rebuilt gearbox could go anywhere near the car, it needed testing under real load, and the official equipment for that kind of test reportedly costs close to £500,000. The team built their own version for roughly £10,000 instead, a fraction of the official cost, assembled specifically to validate months of guesswork before committing it to an irreplaceable chassis. Everything about this stage of the build pointed toward a triumphant finish. Then the gearbox went into the car, and the clutch didn't work. That failure landed harder than any of the previous setbacks combined. Every other problem up to that point had at least felt solvable with enough time, enough money, or enough patience. This one felt different. Pascal, the most knowledgeable person involved in this entire project, had made his best possible guess at a material that simply didn't exist anywhere else to reference, and that guess had been wrong. Does knowing a setback was unavoidable make it any easier to accept in the moment? For Mark, recounting it later, the honest answer was no. It was, by his own description, the single worst point of the entire 6-month process, the point where giving up would have made complete sense to almost anyone watching from the outside. The rebuild that changed everything. Recovering from that failure meant going back to Pascal for another guess, and possibly several more after that, each attempt carrying its own cost and its own uncertainty. But the actual solution that emerged wasn't simply a better material guess. Rob, working alongside a specialist named Andrew, built something closer to a permanent fix than a single correct answer. A programmed system that makes the car automatically recalibrate its own clutch every time the engine idles for roughly 30 seconds, adjusting continuously so that the driving feel stays consistent even as the clutch itself gradually wears. Is a car that teaches itself to compensate for an aftermarket part actually a more impressive piece of engineering than the manufacturer's original solution would have been? In a strange way, yes. This fix didn't just patch the immediate failure. It built in tolerance for exactly the kind of guesswork that made this entire rebuild necessary in the first place. Scenes of careful driving at controlled speeds and revolutions followed, letting the system learn and adjust, until the clutch finally settled into something that behaved consistently and predictably. When the full financial picture came together, the numbers told their own story. Total additional spending beyond the original purchase price came to £39,083, including tax. A genuinely small figure against a car. Experts have since valued between £1,750,000 and £2 million, with the cheapest comparable Veyron currently listed publicly at £2,200,000. Carl himself offered Mark £1,750,000 for the car directly, an offer Mark turned down without much hesitation. How does a £900,000 blind purchase, nearly abandoned on a dealer's direct advice, end up worth more than double that within 6 months? Part of the answer sits in the wider Veyron market itself, which Carl believes has been consistently underpriced since the car's original launch, even accounting for genuinely enormous running costs. But part of the answer sits specifically in this car, a documented, transparent rebuild that proved every disputed part could be sourced, repaired, and cross-referenced, without Bugatti's involvement at all, making the entire model category feel less intimidating and more approachable to the next serious buyer watching from home. Despite owning a car theoretically capable of speeds most drivers will never approach in any vehicle, Mark's fastest recorded speed in it so far sits at just 70 miles per hour.
This is starting to look good, really good. But what we need is constant speed and constant revs.
Would you push a car this hard-won anywhere near its limits immediately? Or would the memory of that clutch failure keep you cautious for months afterward? For Mark, caution won easily. The car still occasionally makes an unfamiliar noise that sends his mind straight back to expensive possibilities, and full confidence, by his own admission, hasn't fully arrived yet, even with the car finally genuinely working. What comes next for this particular Veyron is still taking shape. Plans already exist to visit Mansory directly, the original coach builder behind this car's unique bodywork, to learn firsthand how a project this ambitious came together back when Mansory itself was still a far smaller operation, attempting something nobody else had tried.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is where adrenaline meets testosterone. Mr. Mansory, the legend himself.
A road trip is under consideration too, complicated significantly by a car with almost no usable luggage space at all. A detail that sounds minor until you're the one packing a weekend bag into a compartment barely large enough for a toothbrush and a change of clothes. Even the car's chrome finish, striking as it looks, presents its own quiet challenge, since colors this flamboyant were originally aimed at buyers in markets far removed from the United Kingdom's more reserved tastes. A legacy of exactly which regions still had money to spend when the global financial crash hit in 2008, and demand elsewhere dried up almost overnight. The car also came with 3 complete sets of factory wheels, a detail easy to overlook against everything else in this story, but worth real money on its own. Estimates put a single set of genuine Bugatti Supersport wheels at somewhere close to £60,000. Wheels that, unlike almost everything else on this car, simply cannot be purchased new from anyone at any price. How much of the original £900,000 purchase price, in hindsight, was actually just these 3 sets of wheels, sitting quietly in the deal the whole time? Combined with everything else recovered and repaired along the way, the true value tucked inside this build was always larger than the headline number suggested. A dealer said walk away, Bugatti said nothing at all. A stranger in Spain took his money and vanished. And through all of it, Mark Maccan turned a £900,000 gamble nobody believed in into a car now valued near £2 million, built entirely by people the manufacturer never once called back. The gearbox that almost ended everything now teaches itself to work. The scam is still in court, and Mark still hasn't pushed past 70 miles an hour because some fears don't vanish just because the car finally runs right. If this story was worth your time, hit like, drop your take, and subscribe to channel.